Hello and good morning. Welcome to another installment of Profiles in Tacticalness. So today we will be talking about everyone's favorite shirtless psychos, the Berserkers. So by and large, it's kind of a funny note here, but this class is actually a mix of a few different references, historically speaking. Actually, a lot of their armor designs come from a sort of operatic view of what used to be depicted for some old Norse armors. Actually, a lot of their portraits do this as well. Like for example, in the top right, you see that they had one version that had a distinct headband. They still kept a helmet on there, but they essentially tried to keep that same domed cap kind of look for a lot of them. A lot of them had these kind of I forget the exact terms, but they had these kind of eye and nose guards that you can see, especially on the female berserker from the Lucht remake. Probably the one on the top left is the closest to just a flat out fantasy setup where it's just a giant beefy guy that kind of looks like a demonic figure. Obviously, the horns were a bit of a fantasy thing, which, funnily enough, was added thanks to Wagner, as I recall. Essentially, he wanted to depict Vikings in some of his operas, and essentially had added horns in order to make them stick out from the other guys that did not have horns on their helmets. So now, as far as the historical inspiration of it, more or less, around the time of the Varangians, there were essentially several guys that had realized, we could make some pretty good money just serving as bodyguards. So essentially, they would go and they would find local lords, and they would essentially ingratiate themselves in that culture there. Would essentially serve as bodyguards, and yeah, over time, there was this myth that came out where, for example, somebody would challenge them to a fight or something along those lines, and there would be these myths of somebody going into a fight with animal skins and completely shirtless and acting like a complete psycho, and for some reason gnawing on their shield. Which, interestingly enough, there's a historical account of a guy actually trying to gnaw on his shield, an enemy running up, tapping that shield a little bit, and knocking his teeth out. But again, long story short, history's a little bit spotty on it, but they were essentially peoples around that period became bodyguards. Many of them tried to act like psychos for intimidation factor. Later on, the term ended up sticking around for somebody that was just kind of a royal bodyguard of sorts. So instead of champion, essentially they were just called their berserker. Either way, just a fun little side note here. Now we get to the actual unit in the games here. So these guys haven't actually varied that much as far as the series goes. They are always going to be the dedicated running up and hitter type of unit. So starting off early on here in March of the Black Queen and OB64, really the main difference between them is that the March of the Black Queen variant carries a hammer, the OB64 one carries an axe and looks like a bit of a anime-esque demon bad guy sort of situation. But yeah, they're your basic second tier type of soldier. Actually, in March of the Black Queen, they couldn't be a leader. All of your low alignment fighters could become berserkers, who then could later promote into Terror Knights. But at the time, they weren't actually able to lead. So, for example, if you had a fighter become a knight, they'd be able to lead a squad. If you had a fighter become a berserker, they wouldn't be able to. They could only fight alongside everybody else. Bit of an odd duck as far as that goes. Essentially, kind of said that the low alignment characters were worse early on. Anyhow, March of the Black Queen had that. OB64 finally let them lead their own squads, which kind of made sense if you think about it. I mean, they look like they're supposed to be a fantasy Viking of sorts. Bear in mind, definitely a fantasy Viking. Obviously, it was definitely not the norm for people to run in naked. That was a bit of a interesting thing that wound up becoming considered normal over time. Actually, more likely than not, the One Vision variant is probably the best example of how they probably would have equipped themselves. Anyhow, moving on here. So throughout the series, like I said, basically just a guy that runs up and hits things. You could have your male units turn into berserkers and let us cling together. Essentially, again, still nothing super special. They just run up and hit somebody. In Knight of Lotus, they technically didn't exist. There was only a unit called the Bandit. You ran into one of them in the very first fight in the game, and then if you went back to that same map, you could occasionally find one, but you could never recruit them. So it's kind of odd that they put a specific unit in there for one specific map, but it kind of looks like it's supposed to be a reference to it, so I included it in this list anyway. Now, we get to the PSP remake, and oh my goodness, they were good! They were so friggin' strong. So they got access to Sanguine Assault, Risk Management, and Berserk. So Berserk was the first move you saw them use all the time. The AI had no idea how to use this move, but they would somehow do it right. Essentially, Berserk allows them to hit in a circle in front of them, or a semicircle in front of them, I should say. Sanguine Assault boosts their attack strength by 50%, which, as you may notice there, it specifically says attack strength. It doesn't say it raises their strength, it raises their attack stat. So, essentially, their attack strength ends up allowing them to go and get past armor, so for all intents and purposes, it is a move that boosts their boosts their overall damage potential by about double. It's really, really, really strong. And then you get risk management, which for all intents and purposes makes them immune to damage for a turn. You just stick them next to some knights, turn on risk management, and suddenly that guy can't die. Not that they really needed it, since their defenses were actually pretty adequate, all things considered. So they were one of the hardest hitting units in the game. Actually, I believe with all things said and done, they could be the hardest hitter in the game, second only to maybe the Archer, who is just straight up cheating most of the game, so that doesn't even count. And yeah, very, very strong, reasonably tough. Personally, one of my favorites in the remake. But then we get to the One Vision variant, and things have changed to be a little bit more balanced. So now in this version here, as you can see, they still have their 3 abilities. However, they are now the class that essentially uses their health uses their health as a damage boost here. So they still have Berserk. They get access to it 1 level later. Uh, their second ability, rather than being at level 12, is at level 16 here, so this would be Last Resort. This essentially takes away, I believe it's 10% of their health in order to give them a strength boost, which I believe is about 20%. So it's just raising their strength stat. It's not raising their attack stat. Then over here we have Blood Price, which sacrifices half their health to charge their TP bar. So this essentially means if you have them running in like a heavy two-handed weapon of any variety, they will just be able to outright demolish with a kill move if you have them use Blood Price. So usually they're going to have really high health. So right now they're at level 50, so at 587, half their bar, or rather half their health is going to almost completely charge an upgraded TP bar. So if they're going in with anything that scales with strength, they will just rock faces like no tomorrow. So here's essentially what we have is a few sample builds. Bear in mind, these are not 100% optimized or anything like that, but just some cool things that I thought I'd show off. So the first ones here I like to call the skill ones, as per usual. Essentially an axe build with an axe skill upgrade from this earring here. We've got some greaves for evasion. They get access to some heavy armors and some medium armors. So, for example, they get helmets, they get greaves, they get access to medium level armors here with mail. They get access to heavy gloves, and they get access to light shields. So right here, we have a two-hander, essentially getting a parry bonus from this helmet, as well as some vitality and health, getting some evasion, health, and defense off these leggings. This is the guy that's just meant to basically run in. Personally, I was going back and forth between a couple different skill loadouts for these guys, since having max TP plus 4 would essentially just allow them, like I said, to completely demolish with a kill move. But I decided to go ahead and go for some different builds with these guys instead. But if you're trying it, definitely something that's recommended. So yeah, I have some axe builds here. I have some hammer builds as well. These ones are built more around using the overpower ability. So if you aren't aware, heavy gloves give you a bonus to overpower. Falcon Feathercoat here, essentially just medium mail gives more avoidance. And yeah, then stunning from hammers. Over here, these are there are 3 in the middle here. They're just kind of trickster builds that I thought I'd show off. So, like right here, you may be wondering, okay, you kept going on and on about those poisoned fist weapons. Why on earth does this one have a magic variant on a non-magic class? Well, as you can see on the bottom right there, they get a bonus to resistance. They get a spiked shield in order to avoid melee damage. They get this to avoid melee damage, they get this to avoid melee damage, and then they get a Seal of Evasion. The thing is, this class is just based around evading, trying to resist magic as much as possible, so hopefully they don't end up getting hit by it. Probably I should have given her a Seal of the Mind or something like that, or just Seal of Resistance. But either way, the idea is for this one to be a sort of reflective class that hopefully discourages some casters by having slightly higher resistance than everybody else. So over here we have what I like to call the T-Rex combo. Essentially a fist weapon and then either an axe or a hammer. It's kind of up to you in that regard. But personally I prefer a fist weapon and an axe, which we have over here. Now you may be wondering why. So they get access to double attack, as you may or may not know. They didn't used to have that before. But the fist weapon has a chance to poison, so obviously you get your damage over time. You have your axe weapon for inflicting breach, as you can see here. So this will reduce their reduce the time for their next attack. Additionally, something that can be very good is having a double axe combo. The first one being a bearded axe. This will delay their next turn. Maybe for your second one, you have a standard axe for a breach. Or, hell, even just do that in the opposite order. You get the breach first, maybe you get the damage bonus on the second hit. That can potentially be really good. Double hammers can be really good. Actually, if you end up using both variants of hammers, you can have a situation where you hit once, get a stun, hit a second time, get a knockback. Essentially, if you don't have bash equipped, one of the really good uses for for the side graded hammers are essentially as a double attack weapon. So your first one can potentially stun, second one can knock them away, and then somebody else can come in and maybe you can get a stun on them. It all just depends on what kind of stuff you want them doing. Like I've previously mentioned, there's way too many build possibilities to simply just have them all on one team, and this applies especially well for berserkers because there's a lot that they can do. And this is another really strong one right here. Essentially, just having a fist weapon. In this case, a poisoning one. Give them a shield for evasion. Give them some mail for evasion. Give them some leggings for evasion, and give them a seal of evasion. And at this point, they're more or less getting to Swordmaster territory with this kind of setup. 233 avoidance. So they'd be able to constantly avoid and counter with poison. Again, very useful for damage over time. But at this point, I think this about covers what they're going to do here, so I'm going to go ahead and let these guys do their whole AI fighting thing while we're talking about it. So, like I said, there's a lot of different build variants that you can do with these guys. Essentially, the two-handed variants are what Rakes likes to refer to as can openers. So if you have a guy in heavy armor, that, for example, you're shooting him with archers, it's doing nothing. You're having your casters go in, all their spells are just bouncing off. You're maybe doing 20, 30 damage, and you're just plinking away at this guy, but you need somebody to really take him out. That's when you send in your two-handed guys. If you end up giving them a build that specializes in evasion, usually you're going to have a much easier time having them survive. Simply because if you end up... Yeah, there we go. He's going to go ahead and just use the special ability here. So all of these guys have Reflect, I should mention this. So the reason I say an evasion build is really good on Berserkers is simply because of those Reflect abilities. So they're going to get hit by spells one way or another. Even though you can build them for resistance, their resistance is still going to be a little bit iffy. But it's essentially if you set them up with both Reflect abilities, which they're one of the few classes that's able to equip both at the same time, this will put them in a position where they're constantly doing damage. They usually should be able to avoid the big hits coming from melee. So essentially, if you're having them run up, say, fight a Terror Knight with a two-hander that you were having a hard time getting through his armor, so you would go attack that guy. Get past his armor. He's now in a bit of a compromised position. He's not terribly fast, so may not be going again very quickly. But his evasion should hopefully keep him alive long enough for a healer to kind of keep him alive until you can get him out of there. Now, if you end up getting something like a Reaver Ring on a Berserker, that's a completely different story. Essentially, you could have them use one turn to essentially buff themselves, have them get relatively close. Second turn, you have them run in and do their attack. Their evasion keeps them pretty well alive there, and then usually by the time that third turn rolls around, you know, hopefully the other guys haven't gotten too many turns off on them. If you're going for a double attack build, most of the skills of the class don't necessarily help out a double attacker that much. If you're using a hammer or if you're using an axe setup, something like max TP would end up probably serving them really well. Essentially, it would allow them to go and build up their bar, hopefully get some big hits off that way. But most of the time, you're better off just hitting with both weapons rather than using something like Blood Price or Berserk, because you will end up essentially using all of it for that first one-handed weapon. It's going to have a much harder time getting through armor, even though one-handed weapons and one-handed hammers are usually pretty okay at getting past armor, but they usually won't get past the really heavy stuff. But yeah, if you want to go anti-armor, always go two-handed. If you want to just have them go for raw damage, two-handed works really well. Like I said, I personally really love the T-Rex combo, as I like to call it, because you can either get a breach or a stun off on them. Either one is equally good depending on what situation you're in. But that way they can usually get a poison off. You know, maybe just leave that one unit poisoned for somebody else to finish off, and then they can move on to the next guy. You know, go and maybe get a double buff on them or a double debuff on them. Maybe get some poison and a stun, that kind of thing. It's really strong. It can potentially be really strong. You do have to keep them. It's kind of one of these situations where if you keep them going, if you keep the pressure on, it's going to be really strong. But if at any point that class is stopped, or that build is stopped, you're going to have a problem. I probably should not have given the Glam Rock to anyone here. If they're just going around blowing each other up. But yeah, it's definitely one of the stronger classes. You generally want to keep them pretty well defended unless you go for a shielded Berserker. Like I mentioned, probably one of the more consistently survivable builds is if you go, let's say, helmet, leggings, light shield, and an axe. And they'll be able to usually hold their own on the front line about as well as everybody else. It'll usually give them enough vitality to survive a lot of things, like maybe give them a vitality ring to survive a little bit more. If you were unaware, vitality is by and large the overall defensive stat as far as physicality goes. Yeah, there we go. He's doing a pretty good job over there, but that reflect's going to take him out. So yeah, vitality really strong for these guys. Resistance really strong for them because they have an innate weakness to all magical things. And I think that more or less covers it. So you know, have a good day. Hopefully this was relatively entertaining, and let me know which one you'd like to see next. All right, take care.